I'll always remember Casey Kasem and Shadoe Stevens fondly. In the 1980s, Casey Kasem hosted American Top 40, a weekly radio show counting down the top 40 hits in the country that week. And in 1988, Shadoe Stevens took over as host of American Top 40, playing the hits from coast to coast. I loved Countdown Radio. As a child of the 80s, I loved finding out which songs held the #1 spot each week. I loved asking my friends to rank their favorite toys, favorite foods, and favorite movies, to learn more about them by finding out what they were passionate about as well as what they didn't like. And growing up loving both music and lists, Top 40 Radio gave me a reason to tune into American Top 40 each week. But it wasn't just the ranking system that compelled me to listen. The DJs also shared facts and stories behind the songs, how they were made, how they became a hit, and the details many of us wouldn't have known otherwise. Listening to the program gave me a different perspective of these songs, as well as the temperature of contemporary music in America. So in a way, this series is a bit of a tribute to that era. It's a countdown of the 12 Star Wars films created by George Lucas and Lucasfilm over 5 decades. I wanted to do this as an exercise, to share which ones resonated deeply with me, and others that didn't quite make the cut. But as I said in the previous episode, every Star Wars film has relevance. The one that tops your list or my list may be in the bottom third of someone else's rankings. And the one that sits at the bottom of our list may claim the top spot for another fan. And while I certainly have my strong opinions of the films, as I'm sure you do, no matter how much we can debate the quality and overall impact of each one, in reality, it comes down to personal preference. So after doing this podcast for almost 8 years, I wanted to share my rankings of the Star Wars films with you. In the last episode, I discussed the 3 at the bottom of my list, numbers 12, 11, and 10. I won't mention them in case you haven't listened yet, but I think you'll find my takes on them to be thoughtful in their approach, and you'll probably find them interesting as well. After all, we're Star Wars fans, and every passionate conversation around the franchise is an interesting starting point. And as I mentioned in the last episode, I decided not to rank the 13th film, The Mandalorian and Grogu, since it just premiered this month. But I can confidently say it would probably be among the lower quarter of the list, if I were to include it. This is one fan's ranking of the 12 Star Wars films, from number 12 all the way to number 1. This is part 2, covering the next grouping of movies, numbers 9, 8, and 7. This is a fun way to see what resonates and what doesn't from that galaxy far, far away. And this is Star Wars, Prototypes and Production.
From Coruscant to Tatooine, and every planet in between, Star Wars, Prototypes and Production, with your host, David Quinn.
Vader.
It's a trap!
Yes, Master.
Whoa, we're gonna have company!
Have to stand and fight.
The more you tighten your grip, John, the more star systems will slip through your fingers.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
The Force will be with you, always.
Number 9, Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Of all of the Star Wars films, The Last Jedi is far and away the most divisive. And like Attack of the Clones, it was a middle chapter of a trilogy, one that should have been an easy home run for Lucasfilm. It could have ended on a fiery cliffhanger like The Empire Strikes Back, leaving fans to speculate and discuss it for the next few years, and longing to return to the theater for an epic conclusion. Well, discuss it they did, but it was for completely different reasons. With The Force Awakens, J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan teed up many questions that needed to be answered. And I was elated to know that Rian Johnson was helming the sequel. He had written my favorite episode of the series Breaking Bad, which had developed a reputation as one of the greatest shows of all time. And putting what would likely be a darker, meatier second chapter into his seemingly capable hands felt like a no-brainer on the part of Lucasfilm. I remember talking to friends at work as well as my collector friends in person and online and trying to figure out where the sequel trilogy was headed. What had Luke experienced that led him to that island? Why did he isolate himself? Who exactly was Rey? How was she so connected to the Force that she was able to go through a stunning awakening in the first film? Who was Snoke? How did he shape the First Order, and how was he able to manipulate Kylo Ren, General Hux, and the other leaders of the resurrected Empire? These were interesting and thought-provoking questions, and it was so much fun to have these discussions. I remember hearing a story told by Dave Filoni about how he and his friends analyzed every aspect of the original trilogy and the prequels. And The Force Awakens laid the groundwork for those conversations to continue for all of us. I skipped the opening night viewing of The Last Jedi to instead see it first thing in the morning that Friday. I took the day off from work, but stopped by my Times Square office to drop off my belongings before meeting my cousin and my friends at the theater. In the lobby, I ran into a coworker who had watched it the night before. He knew I had wanted to remain spoiler-free, but shared 3 words that have stuck with me for almost a decade later. Just prepare yourself. I took that as a confirmation that this was going to be the epic we had hoped for as Star Wars fans. And I went into that showing ready for anything, and I was so hopeful and so excited. What I realized later was that he was trying to prepare me for what was coming, trying to warn me or to lower my expectations. The film starts out with some odd humor, but with an intense and thrilling dogfight in space, with some major consequences for the Resistance. And then it returns to the island of Ahch-To, to the meeting between Rey and the mythical Luke Skywalker, the one-time hero of the galaxy. And we see Luke comically toss his lightsaber over his shoulder, rejecting Rey and rejecting his role as hero. Except it didn't play out like Rian Johnson intended. The moment felt more like a Saturday Night Live skit. We were witnessing the actions of an on-screen Luke whose story had developed completely off-screen. There was an immediate disconnect, and the rest of the film did little to help fix that. Some will argue that it is the most beautifully filmed Star Wars movie, and there are many gorgeous cinematic shots within the film. But there are also very strange choices, ones that jar the viewer out of the moment. A shot of Kylo Ren's shirt being pressed feels more like a scene from the 80s parody Spaceballs. The casino sequence feels superficially designed, with no depth to it. And that goes for many of the characters as well. These are just 2 examples, but the film vacillates between styles and what it wants to be and say. Johnson wrote most of the movie with Carrie Fisher. He said he and Fisher would spend hours together in her house, on her bed, talking about the story. And he would return home at night to put what they had constructed into a script. And the end result is honestly baffling. The small Resistance ship being chased by the First Order's mammoth Star Destroyer while running out of fuel wasn't the thrilling chase structure Johnson intended, but became a tedious plot point that trapped the writer, the characters, and the viewer. Finn and newcomer Rose traveled away from the rest of the core cast for a far-reaching mission that ultimately led nowhere, and was uninteresting and nearly pointless with the exception of some heavy-handed messaging. Vice Admiral Holdo was never clearly defined, confusing most viewers into wondering if she could possibly be a spy, until she sacrifices herself by launching into hyperspace directly at Snoke's ship. Poe's path to becoming a leader felt more like a B story in a TV drama. And Rey's training with Luke was too short and felt like the abridged version of what was to be something meaningful or important. Quick, I'll give you $100 if you could name Benicio del Toro's character. It's okay, I can't either. He had a stutter and was playing both sides of the battle. That was his character. And Phasma? The villain inserted into the trilogy because Kathleen Kennedy liked the look of a chrome stormtrooper, dies unceremoniously and without any real relevance to the trilogy. But you might say Boba Fett had a cool design and died the same way. The difference is that 50 years later, people are still talking about Boba Fett. The movie did two things really well. It destroyed any appeal BB-8 had with a wider audience, and it introduced porgs, the bird-like creatures that the public found adorable for a few months until Grogu appeared on Disney+. I'd argue that The Last Jedi is the least toyetic of the Star Wars films. The figures that came out were ones like Rose in her worker uniform, Finn in a First Order uniform, and Poe looking like a cheap Han Solo knockoff. Dull, bland, boring. Seriously, what scenes from this film did they expect a child to want to recreate through these action figures and toys? You can still find them littering the walls of discount outlets. Instead, the main messages we received from the film were that the 1% were bad, that war profiteers often play both sides of a battle, and that failure is often our best teacher. All interesting, but definitely not in the way that they were presented. That last lesson was delivered by Yoda to Luke, but I don't think it resonated with audiences like Johnson had hoped it would. I don't think it was the key that moviegoers took with them after leaving the theater. And seeing Luke sacrifice himself, and realizing in that moment it was happening, was a bit traumatic, because I was witnessing the end of one of my childhood heroes, and I didn't think the Lucasfilm team was actually going to kill him off. Seriously, it would be like watching Kermit the Frog being led to his death, or Mickey Mouse saying his final farewell to Minnie, Pluto, and the rest of the gang. These are everlasting characters, everlasting heroes, and I often question whether we really needed to see Han, Luke, and Leia die in a Star Wars trilogy. The first time I saw The Last Jedi, I came out of the theater thoroughly depressed. On the ride home that day, I started to question why I was even a fan if the company wasn't even going to take the franchise seriously anymore. I was embarrassed that I had spent so much time loving Star Wars in the years since Disney purchased Lucasfilm. The next day, though, I went to see it for a second time with my family, because we already had tickets. And this showing went a little better. The shock of it all died down. I was able to get past the bad pacing and the trouble spots in the script, and I was able to focus on the better parts of the film. The conversations between Rey and Kylo through their Force chats were electric, and there was a real sense of tension and a crackle of a complicated romance between the two. I wish the film focused more on that relationship. Their battle against the Praetorian Guards in Snoke's throne room was artfully designed and beautifully choreographed. I can't remember if it was then or the first time I saw it, but it was an exhilarating rush. But after that, Johnson didn't know what to do with Rey, the main character of the trilogy. He removed her for most of the last third of the film until she returns at the end to meet Poe for the very first time. At the end of the second movie. Two main characters meeting for the first time. At the end of the second movie. 2/3 of the way into a 6-hour story. Johnson said he wanted to split up Poe, Rey, and Finn to give them space on screen on their own to strengthen as characters. I don't think it worked at all. It took a cast that had chemistry and separated them, and paired each one with less interesting characters and less interesting side quests. and I think fans just wanted to see more of the trio together in various forms and pairings. We as an audience needed that, and we were denied it, to the detriment of the story. And you can point a finger at Rian Johnson, but J.J. Abrams is also to blame. A known fan of the storytelling mystery box, Abrams has been able to garner attention with his setups, but the answers to those mysteries never really pan out in a satisfying way. You can't do that for a Star Wars story. And Abrams left Johnson with the unenviable task of answering as many of the Force Awakens setups as possible, but in a coherent way in the sequel. And in trying to tie those story points together, I think Johnson made some really poor choices, ones that have a larger impact on how fans view Star Wars. Because every future story occurring after Return of the Jedi now leads directly to this problematic sequel trilogy. I would say I'm the hardest on this one because I think it had the greatest potential, and it likely did the most damage to the Star Wars franchise. The movie is a mess, with a few moments of brilliance and true beauty. And it's those moments that allowed it to land at number 9 on my list, simply because I like the parts of it more than I like the whole of the ones I covered in the previous episode. But The Last Jedi is mired in contrived plot lines and setups, frustrating pacing, poor character choices, and forgettable life lessons. And if it's going to be remembered for something, it will be for serving as the seismic shock that created the biggest rift in the Star Wars fanbase. Number 8, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I remember hearing the news that George Lucas was going to begin writing the next chapters of a trilogy. It was somewhere between 1994 and 1996. I'm sure the major news channels and local papers covered it, and my mother clipped a small article about it for me, which hung on a corkboard in my room for years. The idea that the creator of my favorite movies of all time was continuing the saga was thrilling. And unlike the Heir to the Empire book trilogy that came out a few years earlier, these films would not take place after Return of the Jedi. Instead, they would jump back a few decades to tell the story of how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader. During the years leading up to Episode 1, my interest in Star Wars hadn't disappeared, but was overshadowed by my interest in girls, in bands, and in playing guitar, and in the transition from high school life to college life. I had downloaded the trailer from StarWars.com in November of 1998, and had to wait what felt like forever for it to fully appear in my real video player. This was in the earliest years of the internet, and the idea of seeing a movie trailer in your home and whenever you wanted to watch it was truly novel. And familiar faces gloriously filled the screen. The thought of Yoda returning, of reuniting with R2-D2 again, and of seeing a young Obi-Wan was a massive draw. And Darth Maul, the black and red horned villain wielding a double-bladed lightsaber, added a fresh tension and stakes to a side of the galaxy previously unseen on screen. By the time The Phantom Menace came out in May of 1999, I was feeling nostalgic for the prime Star Wars years of my childhood. I had purchased a Darth Maul action figure and was curious to see what Lucas had in store for us after a 16-year theatrical absence. I went to the first nighttime showing with my friends Mike and Tracy and a girl named Lauren, who was a secret crush at the time. The electricity in the audience was palpable that night. You could feel everyone buzzing with excitement. Some people brought lightsabers. Others dressed up as characters from the original trilogy. But the energy was more like a long-awaited concert than of a night at the theater. When the movie concluded, the buzz that developed among the moviegoers earlier in the night continued during the credits. Mike and I looked at each other and proclaimed The Phantom Menace as not only the best Star Wars film, but possibly the best movie in the history of cinema. I returned home that night around 3 a.m. and slept for a handful of hours, before waking up at 7 a.m. to see the movie again, this time with a larger group of friends. I also had tickets to see it later that evening as well, and tickets the next day to see it with yet another crew. After all, it had been 16 years, and I wanted to make the most of this opening weekend. Early through the second viewing, a painful reality set in and delivered the crushing news to my system. The Phantom Menace didn't hold up in repeated watches. It lacked the charm and spark of the original trilogy cast, along with the humor that made the early films crackle with excitement. A film like Star Wars or Empire never lowered itself to a child's level, and that's what made the series magical. Like The Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings books, it presented an elevated story that made younger readers feel like they were playing in a more grown-up world, and that they were a part of something special. That feeling of entering a world that was in some ways above you, but that somehow you received an invitation to attend, meant you had to acclimate yourself to it, and that it wasn't lowering its standards for you. At times, The Phantom Menace felt like a betrayal of that. By the third trip to the theater, the film's flaws stood out sharply. A sense of disappointment settled in, only to be relieved temporarily by the final battle between Darth Maul, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Obi-Wan. But it became apparent that this first chapter did not hold the same magic for me that the original three did. I wanted to love it. Today, before a movie comes out, reviews are all over social media from those who either saw it in advance or have strong opinions about a franchise. This wasn't the case in 1999. News traveled slowly. People didn't have platforms to say whatever they wanted to an audience whenever they felt like it. By the fourth viewing in what was essentially less than 48 hours, I was over the initial excitement for The Phantom Menace. I still appreciated parts of it, and liked the designs of many of the sets and characters, but those were mere pieces of a larger, flawed product. 16 years was a long gap between films, likely too long. And in that span, a new generation of Star Wars fans were born. The marketing blitz for The Phantom Menace was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. And to some degree, it may have magnified the issues within the film experience, because it was relentless. It was everywhere, and it was too loud, too big, and too much. You couldn't escape it, and for it to be justified, it had to be an almost perfect movie. At the time, fans chalked up the first prequel film to a story finding its footing. While some trumpeted claims that it was the death of the franchise, others like myself were more willing to give the new trilogy time to breathe. It's funny, but my girlfriend at the time bought me the Phantom Menace video game for the computer when it came out, and I found myself enjoying it more than watching the movie itself. Sadly, the prequels never resonated with me, and I was happy to leave them in the past once Revenge of the Sith concluded the series in 2005. 5 or 6 years later, on a day off from work, I decided to begin a rewatch of the prequel trilogy. I made it through the first 20 minutes or so of The Phantom Menace before shutting off the DVD. Like with Attack of the Clones, I developed a fuller appreciation for Episode 1 during the pandemic. I watched it in segments over the course of a few days. What stood out to me at the time was that parts of it still had the look and feel of the original trilogy films, whereas Attack of the Clones felt like a movie made in the early 2000s. The final duel still holds up, and is maybe one of the best Star Wars sequences of all time. The music, the lighting, the choreography, the breakthrough technology employed, the acting, the pacing, the stakes, all come together for a tense battle that highlighted the power of storytelling and imagination. I wish the rest of the movie had even a fraction of that alchemy. In 1999, we didn't have Lucas's full vision to consider yet. We were still waiting on the other two parts of the story to arrive. We also didn't have 120 episodes of the Clone Wars animated series that began in 2008, a show that properly fleshed out many of the characters introduced in The Phantom Menace. What we had was a 16-year absence, a mountain of hype, an unavoidable marketing mammoth, and a film that had to meet all expectations. Fortunately, in the decade since Episode 1's release, the films and the content produced around them have simmered in a slow-cooked stew. And the generations that experienced The Phantom Menace in the theater, as well as the newer generations that have devoured the Clone Wars series and the live-action series like Ahsoka and Obi-Wan Kenobi, have claimed the prequels as the center of their Star Wars fandom. Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor are their Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford. And while the prequel films never truly connected with me, I'm glad to know that the first film in Lucas's final trilogy has made such an impact on so many fans. Number 7. Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. By the time Revenge of the Sith debuted in theaters in the spring of 2005, I had made my peace with Star Wars. The previous chapter, Attack of the Clones, had been such a disappointment, and I was expecting it to be something special. After all, it had a new Mandalorian figure in Jango Fett. It featured an older Anakin and Obi-Wan, and it kicked off the Clone Wars. How could it have gone wrong? But I had spent more than 5 years following the making of the prequels, as well as seeing the films multiple times in the theater, and talking with friends for hours as to where the prequel trilogy story was heading. I'd hit a justifiable point in this journey that I was ready for it to be over. I didn't care enough about the characters, and the heavy use of blue screen and CGI was a visual overload that made it more difficult to connect with the reality of the worlds presented in each movie. I had walked quite a distance with the franchise and was ready to part with it, and to let it continue on its own. I remember my mother purchased 2 figures for me that May, ahead of the premiere. It felt like a nice nod to my childhood, and how she and my father populated my action figure collection in those early years during the original trilogy releases, which meant so much to me. As it had become our tradition, I saw Revenge of the Sith for the first and final time in the theater with my cousin. I watched as Obi-Wan and Anakin dueled over a computer-generated lava planet, and then finally witnessed Anakin become Darth Vader, with the twins being delivered in secret to Bail Organa and to Beru and Owen Lars. The credits rolled, I left the theater, discussed the film with my cousin over a meal, and left the prequel era behind. In 2005, my life had changed in substantial ways. I had gotten a job in New York City working for MTV Networks. I wrote songs in my spare time, and I volunteered at my church as a youth group leader. Life was incredibly exciting at the time, and Star Wars paled in comparison. I was dating, I was going to concerts, exploring the city, adjusting to working for a media company, and enjoying each aspect of life. And in between then and now, Revenge of the Sith rose through the ranks of beloved Star Wars films for many other fans. One of the reasons why I did these episodes was from seeing how many people had put Revenge of the Sith at the top of their respective lists as their favorite Star Wars film. And as I mentioned in one of my previous entries, I revisited the prequels during the pandemic. And Revenge of the Sith is clearly the best of the 3. It is certainly the darkest, and does a fantastic job of showing how a conflicted young man could be swayed by the dark side, winding up a prisoner inside of a mechanized suit. My love for the Clone Wars animated series helped to give many of the Jedi further resonance, making their deaths more impactful during Order 66, the command given to the clones to kill all of the Jedi. And getting to know the clones in that animated series made that part of the story even more tragic. Years ago, I listened to George Lucas tell the story of the prequels during an interview. It was riveting. Even though I had seen the films, there was something about his explanations and storytelling that made it feel more like a literary classic. And I had realized in that moment that Lucas's prequel story was a masterpiece, and that the on-screen execution of it was flawed. I saw it in a completely different light, and had wished that he had been able to capture that instead. I think the ancillary content like the Clone Wars greatly contributed to a larger appreciation of the film, and the problematic edges have been smoothed out a bit with the duration of time since its release. Revenge of the Sith is, in a way, The Empire Strikes Back for a generation of Star Wars fans. Although it is the final film of the prequel trilogy, it ends with the heroes receiving a series of devastating blows, and only a glimmer of hope. It upends the Republic and the galaxy, and makes the major villain of the story seemingly unstoppable, and victory nearly impossible. And even though the prequels honestly were never my personal favorites, the story Lucas told and attempted to tell is a beautiful and tragic epic, worthy of being included with some of our greatest literary tales. And the demand for further chapters from the prequel era is a testament to how Revenge of the Sith connected with millions of fans around the world. So those were the next 3 films on my list ranking the 12 Star Wars films. At number 9 was Episode 8, The Last Jedi. In the number 8 spot was Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, rounded out the first half of the list, coming in at number 7. Reflecting on this first half, I think the one that could have been lowered into the bottom 3 is The Last Jedi. It's the one that really frustrates me the most, because it could have been a masterpiece, and it could have saved the sequel trilogy. But I'm still baffled by the choices Rian Johnson, Kathleen Kennedy, and Lucasfilm made with the film. And I think it led to the Rise of Skywalker being a mess and a disappointment, as well as the sequel trilogy falling apart. However, as I mentioned in the first episode of this series, I plan on doing a rewatch of all of the films, and then doing another ranking at some point next year. And I could see a scenario where all the films I've listed so far change positions. And I think this half of the list represents the movies that didn't connect with me, or that I found more issues with and enjoyed less as a result. But the next 6 films are all ones that are dear to my heart, for a variety of reasons. And I can't wait to explore each one, and to see where they wind up on my list. So where does The Last Jedi stand for you? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Would it fall somewhere in the second half of your list, or would it be closer to number 1 in your all-time favorite Star Wars films? And where do The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith rank for you? Are you someone who admires the prequels, or is that an era you'd rather not revisit? Or worse, are you completely indifferent to them? Are you part of the growing fan base who proudly proclaims Revenge of the Sith as a top 3 Star Wars film, and possibly as the untouchable number 1? If so, it's okay. It just means you have bad taste. I'm kidding, but seriously, you should talk to somebody about that. I'm sure it can be fixed. So which films are left on my list, and where do they rank? I'll see you for the third part of this series next time on Star Wars, Prototypes and Production.